He said it like an accusation, like my survival was an inconvenience he hadn't planned for. I didn't look up from my ledger. The ink on the page was still wet, detailing the final harvest of winter root vegetables. My hands, coated in a fine dusting of flour from the morning's baking, didn't tremble. 3 years of silence, 3 years of deep, biting Maine winters, and I recognized the sound of his armored SUV crunching up the gravel drive before he even killed the engine. The front door of Ashgrove Manor creaked open. He stepped into a house he had expected to find dark, freezing, or perhaps condemned. Instead, he was met with the heavy, rich scent of rosemary bread baking in the oven, the bright, crackling warmth of the massive hearth fire, and the distant, joyful laughter of children playing near the restored guest cottages outside. I turned the page of my ledger, the thick paper rasping in the quiet kitchen. "You're still here," Kieran whispered. His voice was a low, rough rumble, stripped of the polished control I remembered. It snagged on the warm air like barbed wire. I finally lifted my head, my sea-green eyes meeting his shocked, steel-gray stare. "Sorry to disappoint you," I said, my voice as calm and steady as the fire behind him. 3 years ago, Kieran Montresor hadn't looked at me when we stood in front of the Justice of the Peace. He was 33 then, a towering, broad-shouldered man, built for violence, with a massive V-tapered torso that made the tailored lines of his dark suit look like armor. I was 24, standing beside him in a practical wool dress that clung to my soft, full-figured curves, my thick chestnut auburn hair pulled back tight. My father, Richard Calloway, had gambled away our family farm, drowning in debts owed to the Montresor syndicate. Kieran didn't want a wife. He wanted the Calloway farmland bordering his shipping routes. I was the collateral, the acquisition. The ceremony lasted exactly 12 minutes. He signed the papers with a gold pen, his jaw set, his eyes cold and distant. I didn't cry. I had known this day was coming since the men in dark coats started parking at the end of our driveway. His men drove me to Ashgrove Manor on the coast of Maine. I had seen pictures of it once, a grand stone estate, but when I arrived, it was a crumbling, decaying shell. It hadn't been heated in 2 winters. The air inside was colder than the frost on the overgrown lawn. Kieran walked me to the front hall. His leather shoes clicked sharply against the dull, dusty marble. "How long will you be gone?" I asked, wrapping my arms around my plus-size frame, shivering as the damp chill seeped into my bones. "Until it's over," he replied, already turning his back, already calculating his next move. "And if it's never over?" I challenged, my voice catching slightly in my tight lungs. "Then you'll have plenty of room," he said, walking out the door without a backward glance. His calculation was brutal and simple. He left me with a skeleton staff of 2, Hester, an aging housekeeper, and Caleb, a quiet groundskeeper. He left no car. There was no cell signal in this valley. He knew about my lungs. Childhood scarlet fever had left me with chronic respiratory weakness. The cold air felt like crushed glass in my chest. He assumed the Maine winter would do his dirty work for him. I would either break and leave, voiding the marriage contract and returning the debt to my father, or I would quietly expire in a house too large and too cold to sustain life. 3 weeks after he left, the first nor'easter hit. The sky turned the color of bruised iron, and the wind shrieked against the cracked window panes. The ancient boiler died on the second night. The temperature in my bedroom dropped below freezing. My lungs seized. It started as a tight, rattling cough and escalated into a brutal respiratory episode. I lay in the dark, gasping, my chest burning, feeling like I was drowning on dry land. Hester and Caleb took shifts, their faces etched with worry. They boiled kettles on the gas stove, bringing me hot water bottles and bowls of steaming water infused with dried eucalyptus to open my airways. Hester's warm, wrinkled hand rubbed my back for 4 agonizing days as I fought for every breath. On the 5th morning, the fever finally broke. I opened my eyes, weak and drenched in sweat. I stared up at a massive, blooming water stain spreading across the plaster ceiling. It looked like a map of a dark, uncharted continent. If I wait for someone else's decision, I thought, my mind suddenly clear and sharp, this house becomes my coffin. But if I treat it like a problem, instead of a prison, I might survive long enough to walk out on my own terms. I didn't die. I dragged myself out of bed, leaning heavily on the wooden bedpost, my head still swimming with residual fever. I wrapped myself in 3 heavy wool blankets, the scratchy texture a harsh reminder that I was still alive, and began. I mapped every room in the massive estate, my boots echoing hollowly against the dusty floors. I catalogued what was ruined by water, what was structurally dangerous, and what was salvageable. I sealed off the uninhabitable 3rd floor, nailing heavy plastic sheeting over the stairwell to trap whatever meager heat we could generate downstairs. I found a suite of water-damaged mahogany antique furniture in the drawing room. The velvet was ruined, but the wood was solid. I had Caleb help me haul it, piece by heavy piece, into his rusted pickup truck. I rode with him down the icy coastal roads to a notoriously shrewd antiques dealer in Portland. "The upholstery is rot," the dealer had sneered, running a soft hand over a dresser. "The wood is 18th century French mahogany, and the joints are flawless," I replied, pulling my coat tighter around my full-figured frame, my sea-green eyes refusing to drop from his. "You can reupholster. You can't fake the bones." 2,000. I walked out with enough cash to repair the massive iron boiler in the basement, replace the broken windows in the kitchen, and buy seeds. The day the boiler kicked on, a deep, shuddering mechanical heartbeat that sent hot water rushing through the cast iron radiators, Hester wept. She stood by the kitchen sink, her wrinkled hands covering her mouth, as the first wave of genuine warmth hit the room. I baked my very first loaf of rosemary bread that afternoon, the yeast rising in the humid, glorious heat. We ate it warm, slathered in butter, without saying a word. My grandmother had taught me botanical illustration and herbalism. She used to say, "Plants don't leave. They just wait for you to understand what they need." I turned the old, shattered conservatory into a working greenhouse. Caleb and I spent weeks replacing the shattered glass panes, sealing the frames against the coastal wind. I planted hardy herbs, root vegetables, and medicinal plants, lungwort, eucalyptus, thyme. I learned to breathe with the rhythm of the seasons. Spring planting was a frenzy of wet earth and hope. Summer growth was a slow, humid expansion. Autumn harvest was frantic preservation, and every winter was a brutal, icy test of my scarred lungs. By the 2nd year, the rhythm had settled into my bones. It was during a rare, sunny spring walk that Caleb and I discovered 8 abandoned stone guest cottages hidden in the overgrown brush along the coastline. "They're solid stone," Caleb muttered, kicking a rotting wooden doorframe. "Roofs are gone, though." "We can fix them," I said, my mind already calculating costs. We spent the entire summer restoring them. Caleb rebuilt the chimneys and laid new cedar shingles, his hammer ringing through the humid air. I sewed thick, handmade patchwork quilts for every bed, my fingers calloused and stained with fabric dye. We opened them as seasonal retreats. When the first guest family arrived, a tired-looking couple from Boston with 2 small children. I handed them the iron key to Cottage 3, my heart in my throat. The next morning, the children were laughing on the lawn, and the mother looked 10 years younger. The income started flowing in. With the extra money, we hired Maggie, a bright, fiercely energetic 19-year-old from the nearby town, to help in the kitchen. Maggie brought music into the house, humming off-key, while she chopped carrots, her presence chasing away the last lingering ghosts of the manor's dark past. By the 3rd year, Ashgrove Manor was a kingdom of warmth. The air perpetually smelled of drying lavender, roasting root vegetables, wood smoke, and beeswax. We started hosting community suppers every Sunday, dragging long wooden tables out onto the lawn in the summer, or setting them by the hearth in the winter. The house filled with the sounds of clinking glasses, roaring laughter, and the scrape of chairs. Somewhere along the way, I stopped checking the long gravel driveway for Kieran's black SUV. I stopped counting the months since he'd left. I stopped being the abandoned, sickly Mafia bride. I found my identity in the soil beneath my fingernails, in the heat of the ovens, in the safety I provided for the people who relied on me. I wasn't plotting revenge against Kieran Montresor. I was simply building a life he had never intended for me to have. And now, here he was. 3 years, not a single phone call, not a letter, not a dime beyond the skeleton budget he initially left. And he stood in my kitchen, dripping melting snow onto the clean floorboards. He had left as a 33-year-old predator in a crisp suit. He returned as a 36-year-old ghost. He was broader, harder, his bodybuilder physique filling the doorway, but something behind his steel-gray eyes was fractured. There was silver streaking his dark hair at the temples, premature and stark. He moved differently, too, his eyes scanning the kitchen, checking the exits, his right hand hovering instinctively near his hip. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in 1,000 nights. He stared at me. He looked at my fair, white, glowing, clean, attractive skin, my radiant face, my thick chestnut auburn hair woven into a loose braid, my full, curvy, plus-size figure wrapped in a soft cream apron over a deep burgundy dress. I wasn't the shivering, broken girl he had abandoned. I was the sovereign of this estate. He cleared his throat, the sound rough. "I need a room," he said, trying to summon the authority of a don, but it rang hollow against the warmth of my kitchen. "Your old room isn't available," I said simply, closing my ledger. He frowned, a spark of his old temper flaring. He turned on his heel and marched up the grand staircase. I followed slowly, the wood smooth beneath my practical boots. He threw open the double doors to the master suite, the grandest, coldest room in the house. He froze. The massive canopy bed was gone. In its place were floor-to-ceiling wooden shelves lined with hundreds of labeled glass jars of preserves, tinctures, and dried herbs. Bundles of lavender, thyme, and rosemary hung from the ceiling hooks, filling the room with a heady, earthy fragrance. A large oak work table sat by the window, covered in my botanical illustrations and watercolor palettes. "What happened to my room?" Kieran demanded, his broad shoulders tense as he turned to face me. "Your room needed a purpose," I said, meeting his gaze without flinching, so I gave it one. Before he could respond, Hester bustled past us in the hallway, carrying a stack of fresh linens. Kieran stepped out to intercept her. "I need clean towels sent to the east guest room, and a hot meal brought up," he ordered. Hester didn't even slow down. She paused, looked him up and down with sharp, unimpressed eyes, and said, "I'll check with Mrs. Montresor. She's managing the guest rotation." She continued down the hall, leaving him standing there in stunned silence. He looked at me, a muscle feathering in his sharp jaw. He was realizing that every person in this house answered to me, not out of fear, like his syndicate, but out of love and respect for what we had built together. "You can stay," I told him, my voice calm but leaving no room for argument. "But under my rules, you don't give orders here, Kieran. You ask. And if you want a bed and a hot meal, you work for it like everyone else. There are no free rides in my house." For a long moment, I thought he might explode. The old Kieran would have. But this new, haunted Kieran just stared at me, the fight draining from his broad shoulders. He gave a single, tight nod. The next morning, the Don of the Montresor Syndicate was hauling firewood. I watched him from the kitchen window, sipping my morning tea. He wore a heavy, dark wool sweater and thick canvas work gloves, his massive V-tapered torso straining, the sheer power of his 6'4" bodybuilder frame evident as he swung the heavy steel splitting maul. But brute strength didn't instantly translate to the precise rhythms of estate survival. I watched, amused, as he tried to stack the freshly split logs against the side of the barn, only for the entire pile to collapse into the snow because he hadn't leveled the base. Caleb walked over, a bundle of kindling under his arm. The quiet, gray-haired groundskeeper didn't say a word. He just nudged Kieran aside, picked up a flat piece of slate, wedged it under the bottom log, and demonstrated the proper interlocking stack. Kieran, a man who commanded hundreds of armed soldiers in Chicago, stood in the biting wind, his broad shoulders covered in snowflakes, and silently took instruction from a 60-year-old carpenter. Later that week, Kieran tried to fix a leaking pipe under the industrial kitchen sink. Hester walked in, saw him struggling with a wrench that was entirely the wrong size for the fitting, and swatted him lightly on the shoulder with her dish towel. "Move over. You're stripping the threading, boy," she scolded, entirely unimpressed by his lethal reputation. She handed him the correct wrench and stood over him with her hands on her hips until he fixed it right. He didn't snap at her. He didn't order her away. He just tightened the pipe, wiped his grease-stained hands on a rag, and nodded his thanks. He worked in silence, settling into a grim, punishing rhythm of manual labor, but I caught him watching me. He noticed everything. He noticed when I paused on the stairs, my hand resting heavily on the oak banister, as my scarred lungs tightened in the frigid drafts of the hallway. He saw me grip the edge of the marble kitchen counter during a sudden coughing fit, my knuckles white, waiting for the burning in my chest to pass before I resumed kneading the heavy bread dough. He didn't offer pity. He didn't swoop in to save me or make a dramatic fuss. But I began to notice small, silent shifts in my environment. The heavy 50-pound sacks of flour were suddenly moved from the cold pantry to the main prep table long before I needed them. The snow paths between the back door and the greenhouse were shoveled twice as wide and salted heavily with grit, so I wouldn't slip on the ice. He was positioning himself to carry the heavier loads before I even reached them, adapting to my physical weakness with the same tactical precision he used to run his syndicate. We didn't really speak until a week later. It was 2 a.m. The house was completely silent, swallowed by the deep Maine night, save for the wind rattling the heavy wooden shutters. My lungs were acting up again, a tight, rattling ache making sleep impossible, so I went down to the kitchen in my thick flannel robe to make ginger lemon tea. I found him there. He was sitting at the long wooden table in the dark, staring blankly at the dying embers in the massive stone hearth. He looked utterly exhausted, the orange light carving deep, haunted shadows under his cheekbones. I noticed the tension in his shoulders, how he flinched slightly when a floorboard creaked under my weight, how his right hand twitched toward his hip. seeking a weapon that wasn't there. He was a man constantly bracing for an attack that would never come. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. The darkness felt safer. I moved quietly to the stove, poured boiling water over the fresh ginger and lemon slices, and carried 2 steaming mugs to the table. I set one in front of him and sat across the long table, wrapping my hands around my own ceramic cup to leach the heat into my cold skin. The firelight cast a warm, golden glow across his sharp features, catching the silver streaks at his temples. The scent of the sharp ginger mixed with the lingering smell of wood smoke. We sat in silence for 10 long minutes, just breathing, just existing in the quiet warmth. "You don't sleep," I noted softly, my voice barely above a whisper, afraid to shatter the fragile peace of the room. He didn't look up. His large, scarred fingers slowly traced the rim of the hot mug. "Sleep is when the ghosts get loud." I nodded, taking a slow sip of my tea, feeling the heat soothe the raw lining of my throat. My grandmother used to sit up with me in the dark when the scarlet fever was bad. She was an herbalist. I paused, remembering the smell of damp earth and crushed mint that always clung to her clothes. She told me once that every plant has a job. Some feed you, some heal you, some poison you. The art is knowing which is which. Kieran was quiet for a long time. The only sound was the sharp crackle of a log shifting in the dying fire, sending a flurry of orange sparks up the chimney. Finally, he lifted his head. He looked at me, his steel-gray eyes dark, stripped bare, filled with an emotion I had never seen in the cold, calculating dawn I had married. "I think I've been the poison kind, Vi," he whispered, the admission sounding like it was torn from his throat. 2 nights later, we found ourselves in the kitchen again. 3 a.m. this time. The snow was falling heavily outside, blanketing the estate in an eerie, absolute silence. I was drinking hot cider, my chest feeling lighter than it had in days. Kieran was nursing a glass of water, his posture slightly more relaxed than before. "How did she die?" Kieran asked suddenly, his voice low. "Your mother." I looked down at my hands. I was 9. It was a bad winter, much like this one. We couldn't afford the oil to keep the house warm. She got pneumonia. I traced a scratch in the wooden table, the memory still carrying a dull, heavy ache. I remember the sound of her breathing. It sounded like wet paper tearing. I sat by her bed and held her hand, thinking if I just held on tight enough, she couldn't leave. But she did. I looked up, expecting him to offer a hollow platitude, to try and fix the unfixable, the way most men do when confronted with female grief. But Kieran just listened. His steel-gray eyes held mine, steady and present. He didn't try to make it better. He just bore witness to the pain, silently acknowledging the weight of it. In that quiet, snowy kitchen, the space between us began to feel less like a battlefield and more like a bridge. The fragile peace we were building shattered 2 days later. Nolan Crest, a wealthy, arrogant resort developer who owned the neighboring lakefront property, had been trying to force me out for 2 years. He wanted Ashgrove for a commercial development. When Kieran disappeared, Nolan thought I was easy prey. He had taken to blocking our main supply road with broken construction equipment during peak delivery weeks, trying to choke out my business. He drove his sleek silver Mercedes up the newly cleared driveway and stepped into my foyer without knocking. I stood near the staircase, my arms crossed, wearing a deep red blouse that highlighted my fair, white, glowing skin. "Let's be honest, sweetheart," Nolan sneered, his eyes roaming my full figure with disdain. "You're an abandoned wife, playing house on borrowed time. Your little bed and breakfast is a joke." Sign the papers before winter buries you, and I'll give you enough cash to disappear quietly. I didn't flinch. The last man who called me sweetheart left me in this house to die, Nolan. I'm still here. You should take that as a warning. Get out of my house. From the shadow of the hallway, Kieran stepped forward. The air in the foyer instantly dropped 10 degrees. Kieran's jaw was locked, his eyes narrowed into lethal slits. His right hand twitched, instinctively seeking a weapon that wasn't there. Every ingrained Mafia instinct was screaming at him to eliminate the threat. "Give me 1 hour with him," Kieran said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. Nolan paled, taking a stumbling step back. I stepped between them. I didn't use my body to block Kieran. I used my voice. "No," I said sharply, turning my back on Nolan to look directly into Kieran's stormy eyes. "No threats. No broken bones. No midnight visits. You don't bring that world into this house. The people in those cottages sleep peacefully because they trust this place. I won't let you turn what I built into something people fear." Kieran stared at me. It was the first time anyone had ever told him no, and meant it, not out of defiance, but out of a fierce need to protect something pure. He breathed heavily, the violence vibrating in his massive frame. Then, slowly, he nodded. He turned to Nolan. "Get out," Kieran said softly, "before I stop listening to my wife." Nolan ran. Kieran didn't break my rule. Instead, he adapted. He spent the next 3 days on the phone with his syndicate attorneys. He discovered that Nolan's access easement relied on a forged county survey, and that Nolan's bank loan required undisclosed environmental compliance that he was severely violating. Kieran attended the county zoning board meeting in a sharp, dark suit, presenting the documentation with cold, methodical precision. "I didn't threaten him," Kieran told me that evening, standing in the kitchen as I chopped vegetables. "I just made telling the truth his cheapest option." When the road blockade finally came down, and our delayed supply truck rolled through the gates, I stood on the porch and laughed. It was a full, unguarded, joyful laugh that shook my curvy frame. I looked across the yard and saw Kieran watching me. He was standing by the woodpile, the maul resting on his shoulder, and as he looked at my radiant face, something shifted in his eyes, something cracked wide open. He built an empire on fear. She built a home on warmth. Type the hearth in the comments if you believe real power isn't measured by what you can destroy, but by what you can keep burning. The shift between us was subtle, built on quiet moments of vulnerability. Late November brought a bitter, punishing freeze that turned the coastal wind into a physical weapon. I was in the greenhouse late one afternoon, checking the delicate glass temperature gauges. The heaters were struggling against the draft. As I reached up to seal a cracked pane, a blast of icy air hit my face, bypassing my scarf and diving straight into my lungs like a physical blow of crushed glass. They seized violently. I dropped my iron pruning shears, the heavy metal clattering loudly onto the stone floor. I grabbed the edge of the wooden potting table, my knuckles turning stark white, gasping, my mouth open but drawing absolutely no oxygen. The edges of my vision began to darken, the smell of damp soil fading beneath the rising panic in my chest. I fought for a thimbleful of air, my chest burning as if I'd swallowed hot coals. Suddenly, Kieran was there. I hadn't even heard him enter. He didn't panic. He didn't shout for Hester or rush around uselessly. He stepped immediately behind me, his massive, broad-shouldered chest becoming a solid, grounding wall against my back. He reached out and placed his large, incredibly warm hand flat against my spine, right between my shoulder blades, the heat of his palm seeping through my wool sweater. "Slow," he commanded, his voice a low, steady rumble that bypassed my panic and vibrated directly into my chest. In through the nose, Vi. Count with me. 1, 2, 3. I closed my eyes, terrified, but forced myself to focus on the heavy heat of his palm. I focused on the steady, unshakable rhythm of his counting. 1, 2, 3. Slowly, agonizingly, inch by inch, the brutal spasm passed. My airways opened just enough to draw a ragged, desperate breath. I sagged heavily against the potting table, coughing weakly, my entire full-figured frame trembling with the aftermath. "How do you know that?" I wheezed, wiping a frustrated tear of physical pain from my eye, embarrassed by my weakness. "I talk myself down from worse," he admitted quietly. His hand lingered on my back, a comforting, heavy anchor, for a second longer than was strictly necessary, before he slowly stepped away, giving me space, but not leaving the room. From that day on, we started trading truths in the dark. Always at night, always in the warm sanctuary of the kitchen, always with the hearth fire burning down to glowing orange embers. Each conversation peeled back a defensive layer we had both spent years constructing. I told him about my mother dying when I was 9, detailing the smell of the sterile hospital room. I told him how my grandmother had raised me in a humid, overgrown greenhouse, because plants don't leave, they just wait for you to understand them. He told me about Tobias, his younger cousin, the closest thing he had to a brother in a world built on betrayal. We were in Chicago. "Expanding territory," Kieran said one night, staring intensely into his cooling tea, his broad shoulders hunched as if carrying a physical weight. "We got boxed in by a rival crew in an industrial park. I was commanding from the rear. I gave the tactical order to advance to break the line. I sent Tobias in the lead car. It was an ambush. The car took a direct hit from an RPG. It burned." His voice cracked, sounding raw and bleeding, the polished exterior of the Don completely shattered. "I heard him screaming over the comms, Vi. The heat, it melted the doors shut." I carried his encrypted phone for 2 years after, long after the battery died. I couldn't throw it away. It felt like burying him twice. One night, unable to sleep, I brought my leather-bound journal to the kitchen table and began sketching by the warm, golden lamplight. Kieran was sitting across from me, his eyes closed, his head resting against the high back of the wooden chair. He wasn't asleep. His breathing was too shallow, too controlled, constantly listening to the house. He was just resting, anchored by the soft scratch of my graphite pencil against the thick paper. I drew him. I didn't draw the terrifying Don of the Montresor family in a tailored suit. I drew the exhausted, beautiful man sitting in my kitchen. I drew the heavy exhaustion in his face, the stark silver at his temples, the strong, sharp line of his jaw. I even sketched the fading burn scars on his powerful forearms that he always tried to hide beneath rolled-up sleeves. When he finally opened his eyes, he caught me looking. He reached across the table, his rough fingers pulling the journal toward him. He stared at the sketch for a long time, the silence stretching tight between us. He touched the drawing of his scarred arm, then looked up at me, his steel-gray eyes full of quiet wonder. "You didn't draw a monster," he murmured. "I drew what I see," I replied softly, my sea-green eyes holding his gaze, refusing to let him hide. The real crisis hit 3 days before Thanksgiving. A severe, violent coastal storm slammed into the Maine coastline, the sky bruised black by mid-afternoon, and by nightfall, the wind howled around the stone manor like a wounded, desperate animal. The temperature plummeted, and the rain turned to icy sleet that lashed against the window panes like handfuls of gravel. Around midnight, the violence of the storm peaked. The barn's heavy corrugated tin roof finally gave way. It ripped loose from its rusty moorings and slammed against the stone wall of the main house with a deafening, concussive crash that sounded exactly like a cannon blast or a bomb detonating. Instantly, every light in the house flickered, surged and died, plunging the manor into absolute, suffocating darkness. I rushed out of my bedroom in the kitchen quarters, grabbing a heavy-duty flashlight. The beam cut through the dusty air as I ran up the grand staircase. I found Kieran in the upstairs hallway. He had collapsed against the flocked wallpaper, his massive, muscular frame sliding down until he was sitting on the cold hardwood floor, his knees pulled up to his chest. His hands were shaking violently, his fingers tearing at his own hair. His steel-gray eyes were blown wide, unseeing, completely trapped in the terrifying grip of a nightmare. He wasn't in Maine. He was back in the burning ruins of Chicago. "Get him out," he was whispering, his voice a broken, frantic, looping mantra. "Get him out." The doors jammed. I gave the order. "Get him out. He's burning. Tobias, Tobias." The smell of ozone from the storm seemed to feed his hallucination. To him, it was the smell of burning rubber and melting metal. My heart shattered completely for this powerful, broken man. I dropped the flashlight on the floor, letting its beam illuminate the wall beside us. I didn't touch him. I knew from my grandmother's teachings better than to startle a man lost in a traumatic flashback. I sank down and sat on the freezing floor right next to him. I positioned myself close enough that our shoulders brushed, letting the substantial, steady warmth of my plus-size body bleed into his violently shivering frame. "That's wind, Kieran," I said, keeping my voice low, authoritative, and completely steady. "Listen to me. Not an engine. That's rain hitting the stone, not fire. You are in Maine. You are in Ashgrove Manor. You are in my house." He gasped, a terrible, ragged sound, his eyes darting frantically toward the shadows at the end of the hall, as if expecting flames to burst through the doors. "The floor is wood," I continued, leaning slightly closer, forcing my calm sea-green eyes into his line of sight, anchoring him with my gaze. "Feel it beneath you. Your hands are on your knees. Feel the denim. Count the floorboards, Kieran. Slowly. 1, 2, 3. I didn't rush. I made it agonizingly slow. Board by board. Heartbeat by heartbeat. Every word I spoke was a tether pulling him back, inch by terrifying inch, from the burning wreckage of his past. 4, 5, 6. Slowly, the frantic racing of his chest began to slow. His erratic, gasping breaths steadied into deeper, shuddering pulls of air. His massive hands stopped trembling and fell loosely against his knees. He blinked rapidly, the dark hallway of Ashgrove finally coming into focus. He looked at me, sitting beside him in my red cardigan, and his face was entirely raw, completely stripped of the fearsome Don's armor. "I gave the order, Vi," he choked out, a single, devastating tear finally escaping his eye and tracking through the dust on his cheek. "I sent him into that convoy. I heard him scream over the radio, and I couldn't reach him. The heat pushed us back. I just had to listen to him die." "Then you can spend the rest of your life dying with him in that car," I interrupted, my voice fierce, cutting through his self-hatred with deep, unyielding compassion. "You can let the guilt burn you alive, or you can choose to live well enough that his death doesn't eat whatever's left of you that's still human." "What if there's nothing left?" he whispered, his voice cracking, looking utterly defeated. a man who believed his soul had burned up in Chicago. Then explain to me who has been shoveling my paths at 5 a.m., I challenged softly, moving a fraction closer. Explain to me who leaves the heavy firewood stacked perfectly by the kitchen door before I wake up, so I don't have to strain my lungs in the cold. A ghost doesn't do that, Kieran. A monster doesn't do that. He stared at me, the truth of my words slowly penetrating the thick wall of his grief. Then, slowly, tentatively, his large hand moved across the dark floorboards. He reached out and covered my hand with his. His skin was rough, calloused, but incredibly warm. I didn't hesitate. I turned my hand over and laced my fingers tightly through his, gripping him back with all my strength. We sat there on the cold hallway floor for hours, while the violent storm raged outside, our hands locked together, finally connecting in the dark. She couldn't fix his war. He couldn't cure her lungs, but that night, on a cold hallway floor, they stopped pretending they had to face the dark alone. Type, give me today, if you believe healing isn't about being whole. It's about having someone who stays. The final test came 3 days before the first snow. 3 black SUVs crunched up the gravel driveway. I watched from the kitchen window as 3 older men in dark overcoats stepped out, the Montresor Syndicate Council. They walked into the manor without knocking, carrying a sleek black metal case. They set it on the large wooden dining room table and popped the latches. Inside rested a brand new encrypted satellite phone. The message was explicit: return to Chicago, lead the family, or we choose your successor, and successors do not leave loose ends like a wife in Maine. I stood in the kitchen doorway, wiping flour from my hands. I knew what this was. I had seen the gravitational pull of violence on men who knew nothing else. Without a word, I turned, walked up the stairs, and went to his room. I pulled his duffel bag from the closet and began packing his clothes. I folded his heavy sweaters. I placed his watch on top. I zipped it closed, my chest tight, my eyes burning, but refusing to let a single tear fall. Men like him always go back when power calls, I told myself, my voice steady, though my heart was cracking down the middle. At least this time, I won't be surprised when he leaves. I carried the bag downstairs and set it by the front door. Kieran was standing in the foyer, watching me. He looked at the packed bag, then up at my face. I stood tall, my arms wrapped around my curvy frame, my chin tilted up, fully prepared for his abandonment. Kieran didn't look at the council. He didn't look at the phone. He walked past the 3 men, stepped into the kitchen, and reached for the wall by the back door. He grabbed my heavy greenhouse hammer, the one I used to drive wooden stakes for my tomato plants. He walked back into the dining room. The council elders watched him, expectant, assuming he was gathering his things. Kieran raised the hammer high above his head and brought it down on the encrypted phone with terrifying, shattering force. Smash. Glass, plastic, and circuitry exploded across the polished oak table. He brought it down again. Smash. And a third time. Smash. The last tether to his empire was obliterated, scattered like broken teeth. The room plunged into shocked silence. 3 years ago, Kieran said, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority, I left a sick woman in a house I expected to kill her. When I came back, she had turned it into a home. The ruins didn't need me. I needed them. The oldest council member stared at the smashed phone, aghast. You'll lose everything, Kieran. The territory, the power, the money. Kieran dropped the hammer on the table. It landed with a heavy, final thud. He looked at me, standing in the doorway in my crimson-red dress, my hand covering my mouth, my sea-green eyes wide with disbelief, and fresh tears. "I already did," Kieran said softly to the council. She gave it back. The council left. The SUVs disappeared down the driveway, taking his violent past with them forever. The house was quiet again. The only sound was the crackle of the hearth fire. Kieran slowly turned to face me. He didn't look like a Don anymore. He looked like a man who had finally come home. "Unpack the bag, Vi," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding against my ribs. "For how long?" He stepped closer, his massive presence entirely focused on me. "Give me today." "And tomorrow?" I asked, a tear finally slipping down my cheek. He reached out, his rough thumb gently catching the tear against my fair, glowing skin. "Tomorrow, I'll ask again, and every day after that." 1 year later, Kieran systematically dismantled his syndicate holdings from afar, piece by piece. I would hear him on the phone in his office, his voice calm but firm, converting illicit shipping networks into legitimate freight logistics, severing ties with the underground, and liquidating questionable assets. He channeled the staggering revenue straight into Ashgrove's expansion. We built a large, state-of-the-art community kitchen for the town, opening its doors in early September. Kieran stood beside me as we cut the ribbon, looking prouder of that small building than he ever had of his empire. We started a coastal hiking program for teenagers and partnered with the county to run a heated winter shelter for the homeless. There were still quiet, intimate moments that belonged only to us. In the late afternoons, when the sun dipped low over the ocean, Kieran would come into the greenhouse. He wouldn't say much. He'd just take a small spade and sit beside me on the wooden bench, his massive frame hunched over tiny terracotta pots, helping me transplant seedlings in comfortable, absolute silence. My lungs will never fully heal. The bitter Maine mornings still make me cough, the damp chill settling deep in my chest, and I still have to pace myself during the heavy spring planting. Kieran's nightmares haven't completely stopped, either. He still wakes up sometimes at 3 a.m. with a racing heart, drenched in sweat. He still checks the heavy iron locks on the front door twice before bed, and he still flinches when a delivery truck backfires on the gravel road. But now, when his hands start to shake in the dark, my hands are already there to hold them steady. And when my breath catches and my chest burns with coughing, his broad, warm palm is already resting heavily against my spine, his voice rumbling in my ear, counting the rhythm of my breaths. 1, 2, 3. We didn't magically cure each other. We didn't erase the scars or fix the broken parts. We just chose to carry the heavy weight together. It was Thanksgiving. Outside, the snow was falling in thick, soft flakes, but inside, Ashgrove Manor was blazing with golden light and vibrant life. The long wooden dining table was stretched to its absolute limit, laden with roasted turkey, glazed root vegetables harvested straight from my greenhouse, and steaming baskets of fresh rosemary bread. The room was packed with the chaotic, joyful family we had chosen. Families staying in the cottages, local townspeople who had helped us build. Hester, Caleb, Maggie. I watched Kieran lean over and say something quietly to Hester. The stern, aging housekeeper barked a laugh, patting his broad shoulder with genuine affection, a respect he had earned with calloused hands and quiet humility. I stood at the head of the long table, wearing a deep crimson-red dress under a practical cream apron, flour still dusting my knuckles, my thick chestnut auburn hair falling in soft waves over my shoulders. My fair white glowing skin felt flushed from the heat of the ovens, and the sheer joy radiating from the room. I raised a glass of spiced cider, looking down the table at the beautiful, loud, fiercely loyal family we had built from the icy ruins. Kieran sat beside me, not at the head of the table like a demanding don, but right beside me as a true partner. He wore a soft, dark sweater, a quiet, genuine half-smile playing on his lips, the shadows finally gone from his steel-grey eyes. As I spoke, welcoming everyone, I felt his large, warm hand slip around and rest gently on the small of my back, anchoring me to the earth. He asked me once, during that first brutal winter he had returned, why I didn't just leave when I had the chance. When the boiler broke and the cold nearly killed me, I told him the truth. I wasn't staying for him. I was staying for the woman I was becoming, someone who could take a house that was explicitly meant to bury her and turn it into something that kept people warm. He didn't save me. I didn't save him. We just stopped pretending that surviving alone was the same thing as being alive. Ashgrove Manor never saved us by simply becoming beautiful or profitable. It wasn't the restored stone or the new roof that kept the cold away. It saved us because two profoundly damaged people finally stopped asking if they deserved to be warm. They stopped waiting for permission to live. They just took the broken, discarded pieces of their lives, stacked them together, and decided to keep the fire burning. So here's what I want you to sit with tonight. She didn't fight him. She didn't run. She didn't scream or break things or demand he love her. She just built, board by board, herb by herb, breadloaf by breadloaf. She turned his cruelty into her kingdom. And when he finally came crawling back, broken and lost, she didn't slam the door. She didn't forgive him either. She handed him a shovel and said, "Earn it." That's not weakness. That's the most terrifying kind of strength there is. The kind that doesn't need your approval to exist. So tell me, what would you have done? Would you have left? Would you have waited? Or would you have started building? Drop your answer in the comments. Hit that subscribe button if these stories make you feel something real. And if this one hit different tonight, share it with someone who needs to hear that you can build a home from the ruins someone else left you in. I'll see you in the next one. Stay warm,